Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Kent seminar lecture. Today, we are very happy to have Dr. Gordon Bauer as our speaker. Dr. Bauer is a senior data scientist at Stable Auto, where he develops algorithms and models to optimize the deployment and operation of electric vehicles charging infrastructure, directing over $5 billion in infrastructure investments. He earned his master's degree and doctorate in energy and resources from the University of California, Berkeley, where his research focused on electrifying taxi and ride-hailing fleets worldwide. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Bauer to the seminar.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the introduction. So yeah, I'm Gordon, and I'm honored to be speaking here today about some of my work at Stable Auto. And so the title of my presentation will be Leveraging AI and Machine Learning to Optimize EV Charging Deployment and Operations. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Assad Khan, Kent Rio, Christy Anderson, and everyone else at the Illinois Center for Transportation for inviting me and making this possible. I'd also like to thank all of my colleagues at Stable for their hard work. Everything I'm presenting here has truly been a team effort. So with that, I'll jump in. So first, just a little background on what Stable Auto is. So we're a venture-backed startup founded in 2017. There's about 15 of us on the team now. And we really started just with the desire to make an impact on accelerating EV adoption. We all care deeply about climate change, and we know that to limit the risk of catastrophic climate change, we need to get to 100% EVs by sometime mid-century. So that means ramping up as quickly as possible. And so after a lot of twists and turns, including the global pandemic, that sort of broad vision narrowed into a core mission, which is to become the mission control for profitable EV charging. And so at this point, we work with some of the biggest players in the industry, from major retail chains to charging networks, vehicle manufacturers, just around the idea of trying to help them make charging a strong and profitable business. But before I dive into what we do, I'll just sort of preface it with a bit about why EV charging. And basically, the idea is that EV charging is the main blocker to EV uptake today. And so you can see here on the left, recent surveys have shown that over 60% of prospective car buyers say access to charging is a major barrier for them to consider buying an EV. That's from Consumer Reports. And if you look at the data of just comparing growth in EV registrations to growth in charging infrastructure, you can see that the growth in charging stations has been lagging for years now. And on the one hand, that could be a good thing for the charging industry. That means more vehicles per charger should be higher utilization, more revenue. And still, we're not seeing that sort of uptick in investment in charging that you might expect as a result. And the reason for that is kind of shown by this plot here. When you look at the data of how much different stations are being utilized, there's a huge variability, where on the one hand, you have some stations on the right here that are being used almost 12 hours a day on average. But then on the left, you have most of the stations are in this realm where they're being used less than 5% of the time, maybe an hour a day on average. And with that level of utilization, it's really hard to make a return on your investment. Now, a lot of these stations today are probably subsidized by government policy, but based on this recent election and the way political winds are going at the moment, it's more important than ever that we build an industry that can survive regardless of political outcomes. We really need these stations to be profitable. And so that kind of led us to this question of, can AI and machine learning help with this situation? To sort of start out with how that will work, it all starts with data. So about 4 years ago, right before COVID, we started collecting usage data from chargers around the country, also around the world, focused on the US. At this point, we're collecting data from close to 40,000 chargers, 2/3 level 2, 1/3 DC fast chargers. And so I just put together this animation just to give you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about. That even as we need more charging, that much more charging than we have now, there's already so much charging that's happening around the country. It's really cool to see, even in rural areas, but then especially in the major cities, in the Bay Area and LA, you see a lot of charging even overnight, possibly a lot of rideshare drivers. I think this might up here might be Chicago, so in Illinois as well. And so using that data, we're able to then collect data on the characteristics of the locations around each of those stations, and collect data on the characteristics of the stations themselves, and build a model that basically correlates those characteristics with that ground truth utilization data. So then if someone comes to us with a new location they want to evaluate, they're like, hey, we're thinking of building a charger here. What do you think? We feed the characteristics of that location into the model and come up with a prediction of what the utilization would be at that site today. And so a lot of people then ask, shouldn't predicting utilization be pretty easy? Don't you just sort of look at how much traffic is coming to the station, how many EVs are in the area, and you kind of have a general sense? But the reality is it can be really unintuitive. And so to give you a sense of this, I just want to take a quick poll. Do you guys have access to the chat in Zoom by any chance?
Well, only one of us does. The rest don't have access.
Okay. All right. Then maybe we can just do a raise of hands. I can see at least most of you on the Zoom screen here. So the first station is this is number one. It's in Lost Hills, California, along the I-5 corridor, but it's a pretty rural site. So lower income, not many EVs in the area, but there is some traffic, and it's a lot of longer trips that are coming there because it's close to the highway. Then on the other hand, you have a site in Sacramento. So a lot of EVs nearby. Again, some traffic, medium income, but generally short trips, in the area because it's in a more urban area. So I guess show of hands, first for number one, who thinks station number one would have higher utilization? I see 1, 2, 3 on my screen. 4. Okay, 6. Okay, 6 or 7. Okay. And then station number 2. Who thinks station number 2 would be higher? Looks like about the same, maybe a few more, closer to 10. All right. Well, the answer is station number 1. It turns out that in this case, even though there aren't many EVs nearby, because there are these long trips, a lot of the EVs passing by are tending to stop there to charge. But still, station number 2 is not that far behind. Also still a decent station, again, probably because you have so many EVs in the area. So that just sort of illustrates how it can be really complicated, and there's a lot of different factors that come into play. And so just to kind of illustrate this, again, I want to think through from the investor standpoint, how sort of different prediction methods might perform. So let's imagine that you are an investor planning to build stations at 100 different locations, and you've identified 1,000 sites that you might install at. So you're going to look at those 1,000 and choose the best 100 and install those. So first of all, let's imagine you just chose the top 100 by traffic counts, the 100 that have the most cars going by. If you did that, you'd end up with an average utilization of about 40% higher than if you just chose a random site, picked a site at random. Again, this is based on usage of stations that are in the ground today. So presumably those stations weren't just chosen at random either. People chose them because they thought there would be good usage there. But even if you chose the 100 with the most traffic, you'd only get 40% more than that. Then let's imagine that you chose the ones with the most EV registrations. With that, you can do a bit better. You get close to twice as much as the average. But remember, the average is still pretty low, and so it's not as good as you might think. Just installing at the places with the most EVs today. So instead, if you used a machine learning model like the stable algorithm, we found that you can actually get up to closer to 3 times the average utilization. Again, choosing the top 100. And even if you had sort of a perfect model that told you exactly what the best 100 locations would be, you'd only get up to 190% better than the average. So with the stable algorithm, you're getting pretty close. And again, you're getting sort of twice as much value as just looking at EV registrations, 4 times as much as looking at traffic. So it does seem like machine learning and AI really can help the situation. If we're again thinking if people today had installed stations using stable, the average usage might be twice as high, and again, people would be getting much better return on their investment. Overall, when you think about sort of the requirement for infrastructure at the national level to support full EVs, the more utilization you have, the less the infrastructure you need. And so that reduces the cost and investment needed over time and makes it much easier to get to 100%. So all that's great, but there's one very important caveat, which is that machine learning techniques like this are really best at predicting the present. This model that we've trained is designed to predict what would the usage be over the past year if a station had been in the ground today. But what people really care about is not what's happening today, but what's going to happen in the future over the lifetime of that charger, from the moment it's first opens until it's the end of its lifetime, 10 or 20 years later. And so to do that, you can use time series forecasting to get maybe a year or two into the future, but to get to that full 10 years, you start to have to incorporate some different techniques. It becomes kind of a combination of art and science. And so to start out, maybe a naive approach would be, well, let's just look at what growth has been over the past few years, and imagine just extrapolating that into the future. And so here I'm showing you a map of how much utilization has grown just over the past year. Now you can see it's pretty clustered in urban centers along the coast. I'm not sure why there's so much in Oklahoma. Some in Michigan and Ohio, not as much in Illinois, unfortunately. But it's important to note here that this is the past, and the past does not predict the future. And so if we just extrapolated this into the future, we'd probably be very wrong. We'd also might end up with a future that we don't like very much, because forecasts like this can be self-fulfilling. If, for example, we told investors that we think growth is going to be really high in Oklahoma over the next 10 years, people might invest more charging there. And as a result, maybe you'd have more EVs, higher utilization, just a healthier ecosystem all around. And so we want to be really careful when we're making these forecasts that we're not sort of biasing in a way that might create a future that we don't like. And so where we ended up starting was looking at EV sales and how EV sales have trended over the past few years relative to where the total number of EVs in that area. And what you see is that actually kind of in contrast to the map I was showing you previously, where EVs have been growing the most in relative terms is actually where the uptake is lowest today. And on the one hand, that makes sense because if you have a smaller number, it's easier to grow that faster in relative terms. But on the other hand, this might actually be kind of the floor of this trend, because in the future, what we expect is that lower uptake areas will actually start to accelerate faster relative to higher uptake areas. Currently the EV market is still transitioning out of the early adopter phase. The vehicles are still coming down in price. The model availability is still expanding. And as that happens, we expect the market to diversify and expand to areas today that are lower on the uptake. And so that's kind of the first step we use in forecasting is converting a forecast of EV sales nationally down to the local scale, based on sort of curves like this, thinking about where is that area on the EV uptake trajectory today, and where is it going to be in the future based on that. But EVs are only the first part of the picture. The second big piece is charging behavior. And so to do this, we look at the housing characteristics of the area. Based on surveys today, we know that people who live in apartment buildings and people who rent their homes are much less likely to have access to home charging than people who own their homes and live in single family homes. So what you're seeing here is every dot represents a census tract around the country, and places with more multi-unit dwellings, apartment buildings, and places with more renters tend to have less home charging access, so lower on this plot. And in turn, that means people have to get their charging elsewhere. And so that means you're going to have higher DC fast charging usage, public charging usage, again, places with more multi-unit dwellings and more renters. So you put these two things together, the EV sales and the charging behavior, and then there's a third part where we look at how sort of total demand in an area relates to utilization at a given station, or phrased in other ways, as demand for charging grows, how does the supply of charging grow? Generally, we see demand tends to outstrip supply, so the more demand you have, utilization tends to increase, but it's not a linear trend. But at the end of the day, this is what you end up with. This is sort of our forecast is based on EV uptake today. What will growth happen in the future? And actually, what we're seeing is again that the most growth is forecast to happen at places with the least EV uptake today. But there is kind of this kink in the middle where there's a lot of places today that have somewhat higher EV uptake, but because they're in more urban areas with more apartment buildings, more renters, we expect in the future, even if sort of EV uptake isn't going to increase as much as places over here, there's going to be a shift in charging behavior, where today most EV owners are single family home owners, even in urban areas. But in the future, that's going to shift more and more towards people who rent, people who live in apartments, and that's going to drive up DC fast usage as well. So finally, you put that together and end up with a map that looks something like what we see on the right here, where instead of the growth in usage we've seen over the past year, clustered in urban centers, what we're forecasting in the future is something much more dispersed. Instead of kind of semi-urban areas, a lot in the Midwest, more in Illinois, that's great, more in the Southeast as well. And not only do we think this is the more probable future, we think it's also the future that we want to see. We want to see more widely dispersed charging for everyone, especially in areas that haven't adopted as much today. So that kind of going back to this product of helping people optimize, find the best locations to build their chargers. There's a few more pieces I don't have time to go into, but we have to run a simulation to account for the capacity of the station and the vehicle technology on the road, how much charging power vehicles can accept. That gives us a forecast of the energy supply. Then we combine that with data on tariffs, incentives, and other cost data to finally come up with the total financial forecast of what the return on investment will be at a given location. So, at the end of the day, we think this is sort of a mature product that's really helping major players in the industry site their chargers in more effective ways. So until about a year and a half ago, this was the main focus of our work. But the whole time we also realized that site selection is just the first step towards a really healthy EV charging industry. At some point, people are going to have planned out where all their sites are going to go. And at that point, what really matters is not where your locations are, but how you're operating them. if you think about the gas station analogy, the two most important things with gas stations are first location, but then second price. You're going to go to the gas station with the best price and the most convenient location. And I think the same thing applies for EV charging, but it's also just a more complicated system. You aside from price, you also have reliability and maintenance issues. And within price, instead of just the cost of oil on any given day, you're thinking about the price of electricity that can vary by time of day. There's also demand charges and other costs involved as well. So to go into a bit more detail of what this means, I want to show you this diagram that's sort of the famous duck curve. Maybe you've seen it before, but it's showing the net load over the course of a day in California, which has a lot of solar energy, but is kind of a proxy for what's happening in the rest of the country as we build more and more renewable energy resources. And what you're seeing here is that over each year, in the middle of the day, the net load after you account for solar is getting lower and lower until in 2023 it basically hit zero. This year, it probably went negative. And so that means at that point you'd actually want to pay people to use electricity in the middle of the day to offset some of the peaks at the end of the day in the morning. So as you might imagine, there's a lot of potential for EV charging to help with this system, to help integrate more renewable energy and just generally help the grid operate more effectively. You could imagine that it would make sense if you had EV charging prices set much lower during this time and then higher during these times. You might incentivize people to charge when solar is most on the grid, and then have less charging when you have to use gas power and other resources, thus bringing down greenhouse gas emissions, just generally bringing down costs as well. So this brings me to a second poll. Again, we'll just do a show of hands. What percent of public charging stations today do you think use a time of use rate, which means that they charge different prices for charging at different times of day? Do you think it's 5%, 15%, or 30%? So let's start with 5%. How many people think that 5% of charging stations use time of use rates? I see 2 hands, 3 hands. All right, got a few. How many people think 15%? 3 hands, 4 hands. All right, a little more. And how many people think 30%? 1. All right. Looks like 15% was the was the highest. But the correct answer is actually only 5%, meaning 95% of stations today are just using a flat rate. Even though there's these potential huge advantages to varying price by time of day. Not only that, but if you look at a higher level at how electricity rates vary across the country and how DC fast charging rates vary across the country, there's actually very little correlation. You can see here that electricity rates are highest in California, but they're somewhat higher in California than some places, but less than places like Montana, which actually has relatively low electricity rates. So that's sort of an initial problem. That seems like charging station owners aren't setting their prices to reflect the cost of electricity, which means less revenue for them at the end of the day, and also just a less efficient industry in general. But more than that, what we see is actually that just in general, it doesn't seem like people are setting prices based on what the dynamics of the market in their area. It's talking to charging station owners and looking at the data, you see that in general, people are setting price based on what their competition is charging. They don't want to charge more, maybe a little less. But that results in something like this graph here, where people are sort of herding towards the center, not wanting to stick their necks out, and you end up with a lot of people charging the same amount, somewhere around 30 cents a kilowatt hour. But as you might imagine, in an optimal world, if people were priced based on cost as well as willingness to pay in their area, you'd probably end up with a much wider spread, and maybe clusters based on electricity cost in their area. And so, just thinking about what we can do here, and again, going back to the data we have, we developed a relatively simple algorithm that basically looks at how a station is performing and compares it to all the other stations in our data as well as pricing data. And based on that, makes an initial estimate of what the price sensitivity at a given station will be, as well as adjusting price for its energy cost. Then, so that allows us to make an initial price recommendation. And then we look at how that station responds, how drivers respond to that change in price. Use it, again, compared to other stations in our data, make another estimate of price elasticity and update price again. And basically it just goes in a cycle until eventually we converge on a price that we think, is the best fit for the market in that area. And it's still early days, but so far we think we've had a lot of impact with this. A few weeks ago, we announced a partnership with Blink, which is the largest level 2 charging network in the US. And working with just a small subset of their stations, we're able to increase their revenue over 30%. Now we're scaling up to all of their stations nationwide, and as well as around the world. So really excited about this, but definitely just the first step, and excited to see where it can go from here. So with that, I'll start wrapping up. And if there's anything you take away from this presentation, here's 3 high-level takeaways. So first, AI and machine learning definitely can help site charging stations more efficiently, increasing profitability and reducing the total need for infrastructure worldwide. Second is that incorporating reasonable assumptions into forecasting can help produce the future EV ecosystem we actually want to see. And finally, charging stations today are definitely not priced optimally, and there's a lot of room for improvement that can also help the industry overall. So even though the industry is in a tight spot today, the good news is there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and the future is definitely bright for EV charging. But of course, there's also a lot that we don't know, and still a lot of work to be done. So I'll just leave you with 3 open questions, which is first, how can EV charging be priced to optimize renewable energy usage? Second, how can it be priced to ensure equal access to EVs? We want people of all income levels, in all geographies, to be able to buy an EV and afford EV charging. How can we make that work most effectively? And finally, last but not least, how are changes in the technology going to affect all of this? So, currently our models are assuming, you plug in to charge with the battery technology that exists today, but in the future, you might imagine maybe we'll shift to inductive charging, wireless charging. Maybe we'll shift to battery swapping. Maybe there will be solid state batteries that come out, so EVs have much longer range and much faster charging. And so all of us working to help the industry are going to have to keep adapting to this and figure out how to advise people on the best pathway forward. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thanks so much for your attention. Thanks again to the Illinois Center for Technology, and happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Doctor, for the great presentation. We'll start with questions in the room. Yes.
I have a question actually on the business model that you're running at Stable. So basically my question is that because you have a product with the promise of increasing profitability for whoever's running these charging networks, is what you end up charging contingent upon actually increasing their profitability, or how does the payment structure work, if that's okay to ask?
Yeah, definitely. So I got, 2 answers. On the evaluate side, we're charging people based on what features they're using and how many sites they're looking at. So if you're a larger investor, you're evaluating more and more sites, and so if you're going to get more value from us, we charge you more. On sort of the operations side, it's a bit more complicated because aside from setting price that affects profitability, we're also monitoring where all the sites are listed. And so, are they listed on Google Maps? Are they on PlugShare? Just making sure that they're visible to all drivers, and that they're operational at all times. And so for that sort of, we're actually typically charging based on a percentage of their gross revenue.
Yeah, we have more questions in the room. Johan?
Again for the presentation. So I was paying attention to the initial graph that you shared about the usage of every charging station. And I got curious about the number of suppliers that we have right now, because the fact that you're optimizing it only means that you are taking away cars from charging stations to redirect them to others. So while some may increase profitability, some others may see a decrease in their profitability. So how do you deal with this kind of conflict of interest?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what we call it competition, other stations nearby. It's a factor that we pay a lot of attention to. But somewhat counterintuitively, what we've seen in the data so far is that actually stations that have more competitors nearby actually tend to perform better than stations that don't. And of course, correlation is not causation. So you can imagine, maybe people just tend to put more chargers in areas where they know EV drivers are going to go. But even when you sort of look at the change over time, for example, I think it was about a year ago, Tesla started, opening up their superchargers to non-Tesla vehicles. And at the time, people were freaking out a bit, thinking like, oh man, like is demand at our stations going to plummet? But actually, we haven't seen that at all. Utilization has continued to increase. And so I think there's basically two things happening right now. First is that, if I go back to this plot, you can see the number of EVs on the road is growing so fast that even if there's more competition nearby, even if the sort of the existing drivers might be shifting from one charger to another, they're sort of swamped by the new drivers coming on the road that are sort of, just figuring it out, going to the places they think are best. The other important factor, I think, is that having charging in it is, again, this fact that charging is the main barrier. So if you have more charging in an area, not only are more people in that area going to buy EVs, but in general, EV drivers are going to feel more comfortable driving through that area. And so I think it's really those two things that explain why we don't think it's a zero-sum game. We don't see huge trade-offs or a big negative impact from competition.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Anjali?
I was here, so with the anticipated, say, increase of charging station, I was just wondering what is the impact on land use or land planning? Right, like, so will you try to follow where people already park at work, so they park during that time, or it's lower in cost, or will it invoke newer locations, so then city planners will have to rethink how to incorporate charging stations?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's definitely something I know less about. I can say that in general, finding the real estate is one of the hardest parts of building a charging station. So people are generally looking for places where there's already the space. There's already parking spaces that they can convert. So for level 2 charging, people are looking at workplaces, shopping centers, apartment buildings. And then for DC fast charging, people are looking at gas stations, highway rest stops, also a lot of retail centers, shopping malls, things like that. There's definitely going to be, a lot of need for new stations. People are talking about building sort of greenfield sites where there isn't anything today. But I think in general, with these sort of costs of new technology, clean technologies, I think it's also really important to consider what is the land use of the current system today. And so with fossil fuel infrastructure, of course, there's a ton of land use pipelines and extraction and refining. all across the country, that hopefully we'll be able to shift away from some of in the future. And in general, I think it's the impact of EV charging on land use might be small, just because we already have so much land dedicated to parking. And so that's not necessarily a good thing. Hopefully in the future we can also shift away from car travel more in general. But it does mean that infrastructure already exists.
Oh, we have one more question.
Thank you for the nice presentation. I just have one question regarding where you showed the future growth scenario. So does it take into account of a scenario where there's no subsidies for EVs?
Yeah. So one of the main inputs into this is the assumptions around the national EV sales forecast. How at a national level, how many sales are there going to be each year over the next 10 years? And that's not something we do ourselves. There's already multiple forecasts out there that people like Bloomberg and Goldman Sachs have generated. So we allow our users to choose whichever of those forecasts they prefer, and use that as the base assumption that then we, again, convert to the local area, taking into account local EV sales and demographics. But then if you wanted to account for changes in government policy, you could also, adjust that national forecast. But that isn't, because there's so much work happening already on that, it's not something we've addressed as much in detail.
We have two questions on Zoom. We'll start with the first one. Are there financial models for feasibility of bidirectional EV chargers that sell power back to the grid?
Yes, so that's a great question, and not something I've worked on as much again, but it's definitely something that a lot of people are looking into. And I think the main barrier is actually less the financial side of it than the behavioral side. That from this figure I showed, it's easy to see how selling power back to the grid during this peak times would definitely be profitable. The challenge is that if you're just, I think a lot of the work has been done with individual EV owners, and it turns out it's actually hard to convince them to plug in at the right times or sell power back to the grid at the right times. And so personally, I'm more optimistic about convincing charging station owners to start doing this, installing battery capacity at their stations, changing prices at different times of day. But again, I think it's going to take third parties and hopefully also some government regulation to incentivize them to do this, just because it's not their main concern at the moment, even as at a societal level, it could be hugely beneficial.
Thank you. There's another question. Why not hybrid to save time and electricity consumptions?
Yeah, so I'm assuming this refers to promoting hybrid vehicles instead of full battery electric. And I think, it's definitely happening, and it's a great first step. But if you look at the math of climate change, I think just to get to where we need to be, just shifting to hybrids isn't going to be enough. And in general, while hybrid vehicles help, they're also it's a more complicated technology, because you need to have both, everything you have in a fully electric vehicle, as well as almost everything you have in the gasoline vehicle. So they tend to, plug-in hybrid vehicles tend to cost more upfront. They tend to have higher maintenance costs, higher operation costs than fully electric. And so just thinking about the long term, I think most people in the industry are looking towards fully electric as the long-term solution.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any more questions in the room? Yes, we have one more.
I have a question. Is low usage of the charging stations is because there is an oversupply of charging stations right now, or because people are not using their vehicles as much as we expect them to do?
Yeah, so I think the reality it's less about low usage overall than it's just about sort of a wide variation in usage. Because if you just looked at the mean usage, it's now it's at like 18%. So it's definitely, in that profitable side. Just a lot of that usage is happening at relatively few stations. And so we think the reason for that is it just comes down to location. That people are going to go to the most convenient locations. They're going to go to the most reliable locations, and that means stations with more charge points see much more usage than a lot of these down here are ones that were installed just with one or two chargers. And that means people look at them, they're thinking, well, if there's someone already there, or if it's broken today, then I'm just going to be out of luck. And so they're always going to go to the ones with more chargers in a more convenient location, more with more reliability, higher reviews on PlugShare. And so that means even though a lot of these chargers might be working and available, they're just not being used because people sort of get in the habit of going to the few they know are going to work. It sort of creates this vicious cycle. And so I guess our sort of idea is that if we can help people that are doing this build more stations in the right locations and operate them in the right way, then we'll have sort of a more even spread of usage that will be better for everyone overall.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no more questions, we can end our lecture here. Thank you, Dr. Bauer, for the great presentation and discussion. Everyone, please join me in thanking Dr. Bauer.
Thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for all the
Bye.
great questions. Take care. Bye.
What is that? 180.